Welcome everybody to today's class presented by obviously the team at Gem Care Wellness. My name is Kevin Thomas. I'm one of the few dietitians that works on behalf of Edwards Healthcare Services as part of the CoreVantage program. And the topic of today's class is understanding carbohydrates, sugar, and labels, looking at what really matters the most. Now, before I get started, please understand that today's class is being recorded. Also, please understand when it comes to if anybody has any questions, I would encourage you just to wait till the end of the class or the end of the presentation, and I will address any questions that you may have. I also understand I don't know anybody in the group with regards to their health status, whether or not one is diagnosed with diabetes or has pre-diabetes, or maybe somebody's been living with diabetes for a decade. I don't want to assume that I know any of this, but I am going into this with the understanding that the audience wants to learn more about diabetes since it may be something that concerns their health or someone that is close to them. All right. So first things first, a quick overview of what I will be discussing today. Number one, trying to cut through the nutrition confusion. There is a lot of confusion with regards to what carbohydrates do with our body, with regards to its impact on our overall healthy blood sugar levels. Number two, understanding carbohydrates and its link with diabetes management. We'll then move on to looking at, well, what matters most when we look at food labeling. Now, it says there, reading food labels with confidence. I should say more confidence after today's presentation. We'll discuss what are some marketing claims and are they all that important towards controlling blood sugars? And lastly, and most importantly, we'll look at the realistic strategies for balancing and managing blood sugar. So if one is living with diabetes, just understand the key word is manage, right? As opposed to a cure. We need to manage it. So, what are carbohydrates? So, carbohydrates are but one of the three macronutrients. So, beyond carbohydrates, we have protein and fat. I hope that everybody in this class at some point or another would be somewhat aware of that. Those are the three major players when it comes to food. However, when it comes to diabetes and blood sugar management, carbohydrates are the most important of those three. So carbohydrates, after we eat all carbohydrates, and a picture behind, on the top right, that's a picture of some very common carbohydrates. So after we eat those foods, our body breaks those down into individual sugar units called glucose. And why glucose is important, as humans, it's our preferred energy source. Similar to a car that runs on gasoline, our body, humans that is, runs on glucose. But glucose requires insulin to move it into our cells so we can use it. Those people living with diabetes, they have some insulin resistance, meaning either their body does not produce enough insulin as is required, or the insulin that is produced just doesn't work as effectively as it had in the past, which can lead to elevated or high blood sugars. And lastly, please understand that even though carbohydrates and its link with diabetes management is very important, carbohydrates by themselves, they're not bad, but they require awareness and balance. It's like anything in life, right? So what is good in a small amount can be very bad in a large amount, and carbohydrates are no different. So there's a couple different types of carbohydrates. So we'll start with the top left. It says sugars. That can include table sugar, which is processed, right? It can include honey. It can include fruit sugar or fructose. It can also include milk sugar, which is lactose. So the sugars tend to be the most easily and rapidly digested carbohydrates. Does that mean it's bad for blood sugars? If overconsumed, sure is. Okay. But if consumed in small, healthy amounts, it can have a negligible effect, meaning we can live long, healthy lives, even with diabetes, if we consume some of the sugars, as long as it isn't too much for our body. Looking at the starches on the bottom left there, it says bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, beans. I could also include cereals, oatmeal, corn. Of course, corn's a starch, right? So all those foods, the starch-rich foods, those to me, I think are the foundation foods for most people's meals in America. We tend to like carbohydrates, okay? But they act a little bit differently than the sugars, which we'll discuss in a moment. Now in the middle there, it says fibrous foods. So we have fruits, we have vegetables, whole grains, even legumes. Okay, so fibrous foods are very important for digestion, but they're also important for blood sugar control. So if one's consuming foods that lack fiber, the foods are going to be digested a little bit more rapidly, a little bit quicker. Well, ideally, we want foods that's going to keep us full for an extended period of time and that take a couple hours to digest. Simple sugars don't. Honey doesn't take hardly long at all to digest. Neither would syrup, right? Neither would a soda. Okay, neither would chocolate milk or strawberry milk, right? So fibrous foods are a very good thing. But again, everything in moderation. So let's look at what's the difference between sugar and total carbohydrates. So if we're looking on a nutrition facts label, which we will hear in a moment, uh, carbohydrates is listed typically in bold. And underneath it, you're going to see a couple things. You're going to see total sugars and then added sugars. So the added sugars would be that sugar that is added to the product. Think of a yogurt. Okay, so in the nutrition facts label for yogurt, many times it'll say 30, 35 grams of carbohydrates for what I would consider traditional yogurt. Underneath it, they'll say total sugars, and it will be all of the carbohydrates, just about, that's in that yogurt. But underneath it, the added sugar will be basically taken from the total sugars. So if the total sugars is 35, you will likely see the added sugar being around 20, meaning that sugar, if I could use an example here, is just poured into it for flavor, okay, during the manufacturing process. Uh, does that mean it's a bad thing? Again, depends how much we're having. But it's important that we look in the nutrition facts label for the added sugars. Foods that are highly processed, they simply have more added sugar to it, amongst other things. As I stated a moment ago, total carbohydrates, they can include sugars, starches, even fiber. So the sugars are listed, again, on the nutrition facts panel. So is fiber. Starches aren't. And we'll discuss why that is so. But just understand, if you are looking, let's say, at the nutrition facts label of a bagel, right? So a sleeve of bagels. On there, it might say carbohydrates 60, sugar 5, fiber 5. So you take that 60 minus 5 grams sugar, 5 grams fiber, and you're left with 50 grams of starch. Do you really need to know that? Not necessarily, but for those that might be concerned, that's why I wanted to go over it. So the starches are not listed on a nutrition facts label. So let's talk a little bit further about these added sugars. Okay, like I said, they're added during the processing of manufactured products, okay, or manufactured foods, excuse me. It can include soda, candy, as we all know, baked goods, sweetened yogurts. Again, added sugars raise our blood sugar the fastest. Does it mean that it's something we must avoid? No, but it certainly should be something that we restrict. So if we're looking at what would be like the added sugar, the total added sugar intake for those around 25 years of age and younger, it makes up over 25% of their diet. That's a lot of calories from sugar. Now, some of those people, they need it because they're very active. And the more active we are, we need more calories, not just sugar, more calories. But by and large, we don't really, there's no requirement for added sugar for the human body. There is none. We just like it because it's sweet. As I stated, there are some naturally occurring sugars out there, fructose in fruit, lactose in milk. But the goal is to limit the excess added sugars, not eliminate all sugar. If we try to eliminate all sugar, we are really limiting the number of food options available. All right, so how to read a nutrition facts label. So if we can, let's all take, and I hope it's not too small in front of you, let's all take a quick look at this nutrition facts label in the middle here on the far right picture. Okay. So let's first look at the serving size. Okay, so number one, always look at the serving size, which in this case is a half a cup. Just below the serving size, it says servings per container, about 7. So just understand all the values below are not for the whole product itself, but just for that one individual half cup serving. So we see in bold the fat, we see in bold the carbohydrates, we see in bold the protein. I won't talk all about this. I'm going to talk about the main players, which again, fat, total carbohydrate, and protein. Well, I know if there's 0 fat here, there's 10 grams of carbs, and there's no protein, this is primarily a carbohydrate-based food. Does that make it bad? It absolutely doesn't. But we need to know what's in front of us. This isn't a high-fat food. This certainly isn't a high-protein food. It's a high carbohydrate, but it's a small serving. We're talking a half a cup. And if we look at the bottom, and I'm trying to highlight this with my cursor here, ingredients, tomato, tomato puree, that's what it is. It's tomato. It's canned tomato. Okay. So in here, we have total carbohydrates, 10 grams. Now to the right of it, it says 3%. Now, please understand, nutrition facts labels, especially when they include these percentages, can get a little bit confusing. These percentages are based on a 2,000 calorie diet, which normally isn't what a lot of people consume. Some people do, a lot of people don't. Depending on the research one looks at, everywhere from 3,300 to 3,800 calories is what adult U.S. Americans, adults living in the U.S., we consume. Okay, again, from 3,300 to 3,800. So for those people that I would be working with that may be new to looking at nutrition facts labels, maybe new at trying to figure out how can I best manage my diagnosis of diabetes, I tell them, let's just stick with this at first. Okay, meaning, so if we're over here total carbohydrates, that's 3%. Okay, that isn't that much. But if it was at 40, right, it would be from 12 to 15% of that whole day's worth of carbohydrates. So just understand these percentages, they're a good starting spot for many. But if I'm working with somebody, let's say I'm working with a female and she's not very tall and only weighs about 120 pounds, she probably doesn't even need 2,000 calories, let alone the 3,300 to 3,800 that Americans consume. Okay. So I would have her focus on a smaller percentage of these numbers. Okay. So when we're looking at the total carbohydrates and we're using the nutrition facts label, how many grams of carbohydrates are we talking about for the entire day? Well, it's going to be over 300 grams of carbohydrates. Now, if one is living with diabetes, is 300 grams a lot of carbohydrates, a little, or not enough, right? Generally speaking, most people with diabetes, it's around 200 grams a day is what they need. I'll say it again. Those people living with diabetes, typically about 200 grams is what we need. But again, comparison to how much calories we normally and carbohydrates we normally consume, sticking with this, if we've never used it before, for a month, if one tracks grams of carbohydrates, for instance, wouldn't be a bad idea. Okay, but again, we need to know, what is this food heavy in? Is it heavy fat, carbohydrates, or protein? And I would say it's light, if anything, in carbohydrates, but it's certainly not a protein-rich or fat-rich food. Also, paying particular attention to number 3, it says note the fiber content, which on here is 3 grams. So out of that 10 grams of carbohydrates, 3 come from dietary fiber and 4 comes from sugar. Not much left over beyond that, is there? Okay. All right, so moving on. So what about these net carbs? All right, so net carbohydrates are calculated by subtracting the fiber. And it says sometimes sugar alcohols. You don't really need to know that right now. For today's class, let's just focus on fiber. You take the overall carbohydrate, you minus the fiber from that. So if it's 10 minus 3, that's 7 grams of net carbohydrates, which, if that was a meal or a snack, 7 grams net carbohydrates, it's not a lot at all. Okay? Says here, total carbohydrates are usually the most reliable number. Individual responses may vary. What that means is how much it requires for me to control my blood sugar might be different from one person to the next. So a lot of this, when it comes to figuring out, well, how many carbohydrates can I healthfully consume? That requires some attention. That requires some time to figure it out. It requires checking blood sugars, okay, to see, hey, let's say this 60 grams of carbohydrates I'm having with lunch. What does that do to my blood sugars? Does that spike it? Does it lead to a slow but steady increase to where it's not really spiked and it goes right back down? We don't know until we start logging the information for a short period of time and tracking our blood sugars. And lastly, here it says consistency in tracking, if one wanted to track their carbohydrate intake, is more important than perfect calculations. I'm sure we've all heard the saying, perfect is the killer of good, right? Try to focus on being good at tracking carbohydrates for a little period of time if one's wanting to further understand its impact on our blood sugars, as opposed to trying to be perfect. Utilizing a scale, for instance, does come in handy. Utilizing measuring cups also comes in handy. So moving on, when it comes to marketing terms, for diabetes, a lot of this doesn't matter. It really doesn't. So it says here, common labeling claims can be confusing. Sugar-free is not carbohydrate-free, right? So sugar-free might be a slice of bread could be sugar-free, right? A potato is sugar-free. Well, what do they break down into, right? They break down in glucose, which is an individual sugar unit. So yes, they're not carb-free. Just because something has no added sugar certainly doesn't mean it's low carb. Okay. Let's see here. No added sugar could be 100% fruit juice. There's no added sugar in it, right? But does that mean it won't spike blood sugars? Well, no. If we have a large enough glass of fruit juice, it's going to spike our blood sugars. Thirdly, it says natural does not equal blood sugar friendly. Natural, not to say it's a made up word, but when it comes to all food, you can make the claim all food is natural because, it's something we can consume. Even though it might come out of a factory, it's naturally occurring in many cases. Most food is. Okay, but just understand, blood sugar, it is not blood sugar friendly if it says the word natural. It might be, but it doesn't automatically mean that. Also, gluten-free is not a low carbohydrate food. There are gluten-free breads, gluten-free pastas out there. Well, they're still carbohydrate based. They could have a lot of carbohydrates. So whenever I think and see these common marketing terms, years ago there was this beer, and it was only popular for a short period of time when I lived out west. And you would think the commercial was for like an energy drink because they showed these people working out, having a great time, then sitting back and having a drink. Well, it was beer, right? And it was natural and it was organic and no added sugar, gluten-free, sugar-free. It's still beer, right? So they often use these terms because they want people to purchase them, and they often know that these are, in a way, gimmicky, but they attract the eye. And if they can attract the eye, people might be more inclined to purchase them. So when in doubt, always check the nutrition label. Okay? All right, so let's take for a moment, take a look at this picture on the top right. Okay, it's the same exact food, right? It's spaghetti with meat sauce, right? Spaghetti sauce. And it says here, portion size affects blood sugar response. I cannot say that enough. Many times when I work with people who are newly diagnosed with diabetes, they will tell me, well, Kevin, I've really been avoiding pasta. My response is, okay, that's fine. But if it's something they like, they shouldn't always be avoiding it. And my response to that would be focus on a smaller serving size. Or the picture to the right, that's a much smaller serving size. But what could we pair with the pasta, right? Or the spaghetti, excuse me. Well, we could, instead of having breadsticks, how about a large salad? Maybe with the bread, or excuse me, instead of breadsticks, with the salad, maybe some cottage cheese on the side. It's a nice, unique mix. How much carbohydrates does cottage cheese have? Not much. It's more protein than anything. So if we're reducing our carbohydrates by having a smaller plate of spaghetti, we're adding salad to it, maybe adding some cottage cheese, that's certainly a more well-rounded meal. It's less carbohydrates, higher in protein, has more nutrients because you're having the salad with it, which would also have more fiber. That is a balanced meal. Okay. And balanced meals lead to steadier glucose levels or steadier blood sugar levels. Okay. That's the key. Trying to avoid meals that would be very heavy in carbohydrates is a good first step. Often the meal that tends to be initially the highest in carbohydrates, they tend to be breakfast, right? So as my son, who got ready for school by himself this morning, said, "Dad, can you make me a bagel?" So I said, "All right, well, I'll throw one in the, toaster." And I see there's a bowl of cereal empty next where he normally sits. I said, "Well, did you already have a bowl of cereal?" He said, "Yeah, but I'm still hungry." And I said, basically, "Son, you don't need that much carbohydrates. At breakfast, where's the protein?" And I sat a glass of milk next to the bagel. So it's not something I've been making every day. But that's a lot of carbohydrates. It's two main types of carbohydrates, the cereal and bagel. A little bit too much for most people. And if he had diabetes, would that spike his blood sugars? Yeah, it would. Okay, it certainly would. So yes, breakfast can often be the most difficult just because, I mean, unless we're having some eggs, maybe having some bacon with it or ham with it, there's not a lot of options out there that are quote unquote traditional for breakfast in America that aren't really high in carbs. All right. So when it comes to blood sugar control, we're all very unique. And what affects one person might not affect somebody else the same. It says here, blood sugar responses vary due to several factors. Time of day. Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I mean by that, some people, not everybody, but some people in the morning tend to be a little bit more insulin resistant, meaning they might be better able to tolerate, let's say, 50 or 60 grams of carbohydrates at lunch, and it doesn't spike their blood sugars, but at breakfast it might. Okay. So, yes, the only way we're going to know how our blood sugar is affected is to be tracking our blood sugars, as the picture behind this slide shows. That is a continuous glucose sensor, glucose monitor, okay, CGM. And that looks like the Libre brand. And what it does is it tracks your blood sugars all throughout the day. You need to wear it. It's something that goes on your arm every 2 weeks, but it provides invaluable data to determine what foods and in what amounts does it take to maintain healthy blood sugars or what amounts spike blood sugars. What I recommend, and I know they're not free, but I recommend anyone diagnosed with diabetes, if they're able to get their hands on a continuous glucose monitor, a CGM, it is a prescription item. It works wonders to increase the awareness and to figure out, well, how many carbohydrates can I healthfully tolerate to manage my blood sugars? But I digress. Again, moving on, a couple things, a couple different factors that can alter our blood sugars if we're not careful with it. Stress. When we are very stressed, it leads to a cascade of hormonal events that make it more and more difficult to control blood sugars. But stress by itself isn't the main cause, okay? The main cause is how many carbohydrates we're consuming, okay? Thirdly, sleep quality. Studies upon studies have shown even one night worth of poor sleep can cause a slight increase in our blood sugars through insulin resistance. Now, for most people, I should say for some people, it just might be a one-off. They didn't sleep well the night before. For a lot of people, it could be a chronic sleep issue, and that can certainly impact long-term our blood sugar control. What's recommended is 7 to 9 hours of rest per night. Okay. Activity level. Okay. How active we are will dictate how many carbohydrates we need. And conversely, if we're not very active, it's going to be more difficult to get quality rest. So it kind of piggybacks from activity level to the sleep quality. One begets the other. But again, the more active you are to a certain extent, right? If we're physically fit and we maintain good physical fitness, that's a good thing that will help bring down our blood sugars. And how active people are, specifically exercise, I will say in the 18 years I've been a dietitian, those people living with diabetes who do the best at managing it, they're pretty active most days of the week. That's been my experience. Our hydration level really does matter, right? So if we're not consuming a lot of water, a lot of fluids, what's going to happen? Well, it leads to dehydration, which can alter how high our blood sugar readings show. Okay. In addition, what happens if our blood sugars are high? Well, it causes us to urinate more. That's the body's response to try to get rid of some of the excess glucose. Well, what happens if we're not drinking enough water and we're peeing too frequently because we have high blood sugars? That can further increase the likelihood of dehydration. So getting the standard 64 ounces of water for most people is recommended. Lastly, hormones, specifically for women going through menopause, is what I think of when it comes to blood sugar response that can vary quite significantly. When women go through menopause, it's a sharp decrease in estrogen, which can increase our insulin resistance, which causes diabetes. Now, going through menopause will not automatically cause diabetes, but what it can do, it can lead to a slight uptick in your blood sugars, which for some people might contribute to diabetes versus other people, just something they need to keep an eye on. But yes, those going through menopause and after menopause, one would not need as much carbohydrates as they had in years past. Lastly, it says, use patterns and personal data to guide decisions. As stated a couple minutes back, we're all unique in how many carbohydrates it takes to control our blood sugars. But we're all unique with regards to all these individual, I guess, factors that can influence our blood sugars. So it's best, to eat at regular times of the day, not trying to overeat. It's important to control our stress. It's important to get good sleep so we're not so stressed the next day. Trying to be active is certainly a component of good health. Making sure we're getting enough water, absolutely fundamental to a healthy body. And lastly, the hormonal response. We have to acknowledge, right, that maybe today we're different than we were 10 years back. And we have to account for that through a change in behavior. All right, so let's, for a moment, reduce the fear around food. So a common question as a dietitian I would often get asked is there yes or no questions. I had someone recently ask me, Kevin, for somebody with diabetes, is a banana healthy? Yes or no? Well, the answer is in the middle. It depends. If one's having a banana, they're fine. If they're having 3, 4, 5, 6 bananas, which I've worked with a member in the past, a farmer that used to do that, that I'd say no. That's just way too much carbohydrates. Even though it's a fruit, that's just way too much sugar. Okay? But instead of labeling food as good or bad, I think it's important that we focus on the frequency of how often we're having these foods. And when we are having them, do we have the self-control to limit it to a healthy amount? Or do we just have a very difficult time keeping to that healthy portion size? Balance. When we're having these carbohydrate foods, are we having them by themselves? Or are we pairing it with some protein, some fat, some healthy fiber? Kind of like in the picture to the right, right? That's a salad. This looks like grilled chicken breasts. Not bad. Is it a complete meal? Maybe for some that don't have much of an appetite, but you would likely need some carbohydrates with that. Why not a roll, right? The carbohydrates don't have to make up the bulk of the meal, but it provides some substance beyond just a salad with dressing, a few, strips of grilled chicken. The timing is key as well. So if I could take just one moment and discuss this a little bit further, okay? Now, if one eats right before bed, I could pose a question, is that good, yes or no? And I'd say, well, it depends. If it's been several hours since you last ate and you are hungry, and it's the only time you have to eat, well, then you need to eat. I wouldn't encourage skipping that. But if one eats just because they're bored and they're not hungry, well, if one eats when they're not hungry, what's going to happen to their blood sugar levels? Chances are it's going to spike, right? So you don't really need that. One strategy that I talk with a lot of people about is if we're able to have the largest meal of the day, lunch, how would that impact their blood sugars? Why that question is so important, most people after dinner are pretty sedentary. By and large, I'm making some glaring opinionated remarks, but a lot of people after dinner, they're relaxing around their house. They might clean up some things, this and that, and maybe help with homework. But by and large, we're not very overly active after dinner. Well, what meal tends to be the largest in carbohydrates for most Americans? It's dinner. So one thing I see when I talk with members, you would see it, their blood sugar goes up for breakfast and lunch, and then there's dinner. It goes way up, and it stays up for several hours for many people. So I truly think that dinner is the most important meal a day simply because it's the largest. And if we acknowledge that and try to make just a few changes with dinner, often that can be a good first step to further controlling blood sugars. All right, so a few practical strategies that work. All right, so build balanced plates. We've already talked about that. Okay, balance is key. The picture to the right would show that, right? So here we have some avocado, we have tomatoes, looks like chickpeas, eggs, grapes. We have an avocado for healthy oil, right? And over here we have some seeds. It looks like could be chia, I think it is. That isn't bad. Now, would that be a usual meal for most people? I'd say no. It's got a lot of color. It's got a lot of certainly has a good amount of nutrition in there. I mean, look at all that color. Look at the variety there. And it's not dominating just one thing, right? Like a plate of pasta would. So for anybody really trying to buckle down and control their blood sugars, what I would recommend is bulletin point number 2, track total carbohydrates per meal. So for anyone trying to control their blood sugars, and they're kind of new to this, I'd say from 45 to about 60 grams of carbohydrates per meal tends to be enough. It won't lead to huge spikes in blood sugar for most people, but it also won't drain you to where your blood sugar levels are real low and you don't have much energy. It's all about balance. It says here we need to pair carbohydrates with protein. Now, if we're only having meals that are carbohydrate dense, why is that a bad thing? Well, please understand that the fat and protein in the foods we eat slow the digestion of carbohydrates. So if we're having, let's say, I don't know why one would have this, but let's say one wakes up and they're in a hurry. They throw a bagel, again with a bagel reference, into the toaster and then grab a glass of orange juice. So they're going to have a dry bagel with orange juice. Well, that's going to lead to a pretty consistent and immediate spike in blood sugar. All the sugar, no protein, very little fiber, no fat in orange juice. And you really only have carbohydrates, very little fiber with a bagel, basically no protein and basically no fat. It's going to cause the blood sugars to rise. So having some protein with the carbohydrates is important. Okay. Obviously, portion size matters. Maintaining consistent meal timing is something we haven't really talked about. So I could give an example of a gentleman I recently worked with who's in law enforcement. He says, Kevin, when I eat, I eat. And I wanted to find out more. And I said, well, why? Explain to me what's going on. He says, well, if I don't eat a lot when I eat, I might go long, long periods of time without food, and I'll be really hungry. So his strategy was at the beginning of his shift when he starts, work in the community, he typically gets something to eat. He says, Kevin, it's a lot of calories, but then I'm good for at least 12 hours, meaning he's stuffed. He's making his blood sugars basically get him by until the end of the day. Well, what happens because of that meal? I guarantee, and I've seen it in his blood work, it leads to super high blood sugars, right? And the only time they come down in a healthy range is right at the end of his shift, right? That wouldn't work. Or I should say, that's not going to work long term for health. What he should do is have a smaller meal to start his shift, and maybe, if he's able, in this case, if he's able, maybe have a protein bar in glove compartment, maybe some beef jerky, maybe have a Nutri-Grain bar. Okay. Is it the best options out there? No, but it's quick easy, it's shelf stable, and you can throw it in a glove compartment, as opposed to just having a lot of calories to start a shift. I know some nurses that work the same way because they might get very busy, just like law enforcement would. So when they eat, they eat, but that spikes blood sugars almost every single time. Okay. And lastly, it says learn from patterns. Like I stated a couple minutes back, this is why I'm a big fan of continuous glucose monitors, because you can see with high accuracy where your blood sugar has been all day. So if you review that information at the end of your day, you can go, all right, was today good or bad or kind of a usual day? Uh-oh, I had two spikes, one during breakfast or one after breakfast, one after lunch. Why was that? Maybe the person had to plan a little bit better. Maybe the person just overate. Maybe the person, because they weren't paying attention, this happens a lot, instead of, maybe they had some Powerade or an energy drink that has sugar. Do they really need sugar? No. As I said earlier, added sugar is not a requirement for the human body, but it's just popular in a lot of drinks. So it could be these little situations that a person observes through learning through their patterns to understand that, all right, maybe I can't have that drink with that particular meal because it's carbs on top of carbs. There's too much carbs. All right. So the biggest, I guess, overarching message is progress, not perfection. With people that don't have diabetes, please understand their blood sugars can still spike if they have a large carb meal. Absolutely. Okay. So those living with diabetes, they should expect occasional blood sugar spikes. They should expect some days to be imperfect, that just don't go according to plan. Obviously, we need to learn from our lesson. If these imperfect days, these occasional glucose spikes, if it's a regular occurrence, that's where I would encourage that person to buckle down and think of some strategies of what to do different in the future. Now, it says one reading does not define success. One individual blood sugar reading, let's say it's over 180, which would be defined as a blood sugar spike. That's okay. What if it's 200? That's okay. What if it's 300? People see those all the time. The goal is to try to minimize those times. Okay? Minimize those. And lastly, nutrition management focuses on long-term patterns, similar to a doctor wanting its patient's hemoglobin A1C, which is a simple lab draw at their doctor's office or the lab that'll show how well over a 3-month period one has been controlling their blood sugars. Well, that is long-term data. 3 months worth of information lets the doctor and you understand how well have I been controlling my blood sugars and do I need to do anything different? Okay, so again, long-term patterns are key. So how can the CoreVantage program help? It says here, when you join Edwards Healthcare Services and enroll in the CoreVantage program, you get more than supplies. You get a full support system. Automatic refill reminders so you never run out through the folks at Edwards Healthcare Services. Personalized coaching from registered dietitians like myself. And I have to stress to you, there's no cookie cutter approach to this. We meet members where they're at and see what they want to focus on. Only focusing on a couple changes at a time. Because again, it's about long-term maintenance, not just a short-term hack. We'll provide education resources on exercise, diet, even wellness. And the employees at Edwards Healthcare Services, they will help you with navigating through insurance and your coverage. So basically, you have a dedicated care team to keep you consistent, confident, and absolutely in control of one's blood sugars. Diabetes is something that people can live with decades upon decades upon decades. I've worked with people that have had diabetes over 60 years. Okay. It's something that should not curtail your quality of life or duration of life if you stay on top of it. It says here in the bottom, it's not about being perfect. It's about creating a routine that works for you. And Edwards Healthcare Services is here to make that much easier. Okay, so if anyone does want to enroll in the CoreVantage program, that's a free nutrition consultation program where you'd be working with me as well as a couple other dietitians, but typically one at a time. Every 3 months, we would call you, see how things are coming along, answer any questions you might have. We could discuss exercise, nutrition, We could discuss labs, stress, sleep improvement, all these aspects that determine how well one's blood sugars are being controlled. So to summarize, total carbohydrates matter more than just sugar alone. Not to say a high sugar diet is great, but the total amount of carbohydrates consumed is the most important factor, as opposed to just one focus on, fiber or focusing on carbohydrates like starch or simple sugars. Their serving size is critical. We need to make sure that we're not overeating. And for many people I work with that are very newly diagnosed with diabetes, I'll ask them, how often, if you overeat, do you overeat? And for some people, that's just the first step. Avoid overeating. Let's focus at maybe purchasing some smaller bowls, smaller plates, smaller cups. Just get accustomed to eating smaller portions. Thirdly, marketing claims can be misleading. Balance and portion awareness help to stabilize blood sugar control. Okay. The key is help stabilize. There's no cure, but we can manage this. Okay. And individual responses vary. Some people require way more carbohydrates than others. But by and large, those diagnosed with diabetes need to understand we need to eat a little bit less carbohydrates to be able to have healthier blood sugar control. So the last goal says here, understanding carbs, not eliminating them. That's very common when I talk with people who are newly diagnosed with diabetes. They'll say, Kevin, I'm done eating carbs. In the back of my mind, I'm like, well, short term, that might be a good solution to get your blood sugars under control. But long term, that's not a solution that's going to work for most people. It just isn't. Okay, it's about management. All right. So this is the time for Q&A. So I will go to our little box here and see if we have any questions from anybody in the audience. Now, I don't know if I can hear from anybody, but we do have a little chat box that we can use in the interim. I'll give you a couple minutes if anyone has any questions they wanted to ask. I know I got a few questions I jotted down that came to me before I gave the presentation. Maybe I should start with one of those right now. I think I will. Let's see. Yeah, I think I will. All right, so one of the first questions was, is fruit healthy with diabetes, right? So fruit does contain natural sugars, right? It also contains fiber, contains other nutrients, phytonutrients that are very good for heart health, very good for myriad of health conditions. So fruit is fine. The biggest takeaway is we don't really need that much. So one serving of fruit is about the size of a tennis ball. Most people will be wise to have 2, maybe 3 servings of fruit per day. So the question earlier that one of my past members that posed to me, are bananas healthy? Well, most bananas, if it's a large banana, that's going to be close to 2 servings of fruit. That might be all the fruit that you need for that day. Okay. So again, fruit is healthy. We just don't need a whole lot. We just don't. Okay. What's the other question on here? Just a minute. Should I completely avoid sugar? No. That would be my first thought. Trying to minimize it? I mean, a good first step for some people, and this would be somebody I've worked with recently, they were accustomed to starting their day with Dr. Pepper. And my thought was, how about and I'll get to the question here in a minute from Leslie. My suggestion to that person was, well, what about coffee first thing in the morning instead? She doesn't like coffee. I said, what about water? She doesn't like the taste of water. It's flavorless. It's water, right? I said, well, what about diet Dr. Pepper? So that's her strategy right now because she doesn't want to give up the sweets in the morning. And water isn't sweet whatsoever. Coffee is not sweet enough that, for her, it's too bitter. So that would be a good strategy in the short term to get her to the point where she's consuming less sweets, or in her case, less sugar beverages. Switch the diet. It won't impact your blood sugars like regular soda would at all. All right, so we'll get to Leslie's question, and thank you for that. It says, should the goal be no spikes in blood sugar? Or if there is a spike, what is acceptable? Very good question. So the goal initially shouldn't be no spikes in blood sugars. And I'll give you an idea what I mean. Okay. So anytime one's blood sugars go over 180, that's milligrams per deciliter. If you pricked your finger and tested it, or if you're using one of the sensors that goes on your arm, that's the units it shows. Anything over 180 is considered a spike. For some people, that might be a good goal. But if you're newly diagnosed with diabetes, that's not a good goal. Now, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so a couple minutes back, I had mentioned a test taken at the doctor's office. It's called a hemoglobin A1C test. And for most people diagnosed with diabetes, a test result of 7% is the goal. Well, what does that mean, 7%? Does that mean there's no blood sugar spikes? What that means is their blood sugar is well controlled about 70% of the time. So they're going to be seeing even a lot of blood sugar spikes throughout the day, throughout the weeks, with an A1C of 7. Now, if one has been living with diabetes for quite a while and their A1C is like a 6 and they have it very tightly controlled, maybe that person can keep their blood sugar spikes at a minimum. But I will say this, because I work with a lot of people that have diabetes, and I work with a lot of people that allow me to see what their blood sugars look like through the continuous glucose monitors, those CGMs. So I can go online, there's a couple different sites, I can see their blood sugars. Only one person, I guess there's almost two people I work with who they rarely ever see blood sugar spikes. When I say rarely, rarely. Okay. Most everybody, and their blood sugars are like 5.5 for hemoglobin A1C, even a 6 in some cases, which is really good. Most people are going to see blood sugar spikes. The goal is try not to see them too often. So the second part of your question, is there a spike that is acceptable? The answer is yes. You really try to keep those blood sugar spikes under 250. Under 250 milligrams per deciliter. Anything above 250 is considered very high. So, which I guess would bring up another part to this answer. If one has a history of really high blood sugars, maybe first focusing on getting to the point where we don't see a lot of blood sugars, maybe any at all, above 250. Then we try to tighten that a little bit further. Maybe no blood sugars above 200, and then no blood sugars above 180. Okay. Yeah, just understand, even those with pre-diabetes, or even living without pre-diabetes or diabetes, type 2 diabetes, they can still see blood sugar spikes if they overeat, you know. So it's not just exclusively reserved for those people diagnosed. All right. I think that's all the questions I had. Is there any other questions from anybody? I'll give you just one more minute. Maybe there's a question coming through. All right. Well, thank you, Leslie. Well, everybody, thank you very much for your time. Take care and have yourself a good week. Thank you.